When we talk about the history of Ireland, we often focus on battles, rebellions, kings and saints. But woven through the centuries is another story, quieter perhaps, but just as important. It is the story of Irish wool. The story of Irish wool is very long and distinguished, although most would find that hard to believe given the state of the industry today. With a global textile market today of approximately 98 million tonnes, wool is no longer the fibre of choice. But synthetic fibres are not biodegradable, and our health and planet are suffering from their microplastics. Whereas wool is sustainable and incredibly versatile, and will have to be an essential part of our sustainable fabric future.
I went completely ignorantly to the wool shop and said, "Can I have your softest Irish wool?" And they looked at me like I had two heads. They were like, "Oh, Irish wool? Oh, we don't have any of that." And I was just like, I don't get it. I'm from Dublin. When I travel anywhere outside Dublin, there's sheep everywhere. Isn't our history in wool? Aren't we famous for woolen mills, art sweaters, weaving? What the hell happened?
The pride and how we have lost that. We're gone from that and the respect that there was for wool to today is we throw it into a pack and let the next man deal with it.
It wasn't always that way, no. I mean, you know yourself, that history tells us that there was wool that was of a much more high-end use value than what's here today.
Irish wool once had such incredible success that it was feared and attacked by tariffs and prohibition to try and destroy it. But it did survive. So in telling this story, we might be able to show that today's problems are just one more down before the up, that history has told us keeps happening.
Authorities state as an established fact that Irish woolens were well known and highly valued, long before England developed her cloth manufacture.
So to start at the very beginning, we do believe that the domestic sheep would have come from the Asiatic mouflon, which actually still exists today in certain parts of Asia. So this was a brownish grey sheep with patches of white and black. Our earliest evidence for domestic sheep in Ireland actually dates to the late Mesolithic period. So excavations at Ferder's Cove, which is a coastal site on the Dingle Peninsula down in Kerry, produced evidence of sheep bones. A cattle tooth was dated from that site, which gave a date of 4,500 to around 4,200 BC. So that will be our earliest evidence of sheep in Ireland.
So the earliest woolen cloth that we have here in the collection at the National Museum comes from Armagh, County Antrim. That woolen cloth is almost a metre square. It was made in two pieces and it's sewn together. It shows evidence for borders and selvages. So that's the earliest textile that we have dated. It's dated to between 900 and 500 BC.
Archaeological evidence shows that spinning and weaving were part of daily life in Ireland. Loom weights and spindle whorls tells us that families were producing clothing for their kin, embedding textile production deep into the fabric of society.
The evidence for textiles and wool in the collection of the museum up until the 1970s was fairly scant. There wasn't a huge body of material to work with, and that changed dramatically in the 70s and 80s with the urban excavations, the Viking and Norman excavations in Dublin, Waterford. So there was over 2,000 textile fragments found at Wood Quay in Dublin, and obviously this provided a whole new body of evidence for people to work with when it came to kind of studying textiles and textile production and wool.
There are 130 phrases and words in our vocabulary today from the world of wool, like bigwig, black sheep, dyed in the wool, losing the thread, cottoning on, and lining the pocket.
Even when the woolly sheep are arriving, cattle are still the most dominant species in Ireland. That's not the case in England, where sheep take over, is the case in Ireland. And so the Brehon laws show us that cattle maintain that really prominent position in Irish society. And obviously we have a lot of stories about cattle and how important they were to people and the raids that people went on in order to capture cattle. But sheep are also clearly important. They have this secondary role in the Brehon laws. They appear in various myths and pieces of folklore. So we know that sheep were important to people and that they were still heavily invested in their sheep and in controlling and protecting those animals as well.
So there isn't distinct descriptions of the type of breeds we might have had at that time, but we do get more of a discussion on the colour of the fleeces that we do see in medieval Ireland. So typically they are more of the darker, the browns and the black colour fleeces, with white fleeces, sheep with white fleeces occurring in lesser amounts, but of a higher value because of their scarcity and because of their ease for dyeing the fleece as well.
Sheep at this time were farmed primarily to produce wool for clothing, and they also had other uses. Sheepskins with wool still attached were used for bedding, rugs and overcoats. Sheep's milk was used to make cheese, and then eventually the meat was sold as well. The importance given to wool at this time can be seen as the King of Cashel demanded as tribute from one vassal 1,000 cloaks and 1,000 milch cows, while for others he extracts cloaks with white borders or napped cloaks trimmed with purple.
We see an increase in the medieval period, particularly from the 10th century onwards, in the volume of sheep in Ireland, and this is seen to be linked with the wool trade. So the export of wool in the medieval period would have involved materials such as the raw wool, woolen cloaks, shawls and mantles. So it would have been a range of materials.
So from about 3,000 years ago, there's good fine wool that would not have felt coarse or itchy to wear. There are some fabrics produced that are coarser, but we can therefore say that they meant to produce those coarser fabrics for particular outerwear or insulation, but when they wanted fine fabrics, they were able to produce them.
You can see that there's a woolen industry, a native woolen industry bubbling there, or at least there's the ingredients of it in the late medieval period. But Ireland always has that competition next door to it and on the continent. In England and in the Low Countries, there's probably, we'll say, bigger woolen production industries there that Ireland has to contend with. So there was always the temptation to just use Ireland as a source of the raw product.
On the Dublin Guild merchant rolls of that period are registered representatives of almost every craft or trade from France, Brabant and Flanders.
A weasel was a device used for measuring the lengths of yarn, which made a popping sound to mark the yardage, which then became a song called Pop Goes the Weasel.
By the Middle Ages, wool had become Europe's most important commodity. Irish cloth, praised for its quality and softness, was traded across the continent. Irish cloaks reached Naples, Florence, Genoa and Bologna. The Pope's agent in England obtained a license to export several Irish woolen mantles across the Alps into Italy. Irish serge was used in Naples as trimming for the robes of the King and Queen. Its presence in Florence, Genoa, Como and Bologna is known to all students of commerce in the Middle Ages. And Irish mantles were treated as heirlooms by Italian families.
If the serges of Ireland were eagerly sought after and worn with a preference by the polished Italians and particularly by the Florentines, it must have been for the excellence of their quality.
And we know that Irish wool is cheaply produced compared to other forms of wool in the British Empire, and we know that it's good quality. And we know that because English people were very concerned, English farmers are very concerned about Irish wool.
Ireland's growing wool success was attracting anger in the English industry, and they began a series of laws restricting Irish trade.
Until Queen Elizabeth's reign, the Irish had a flourishing trade in supplying England with cattle. This was then forbidden by Act of Parliament. Thereupon the Irish killed their cattle at home and sent them to England as salted meat. This provoked another Act of Parliament, forbidding the importation of cattle from Ireland dead or alive. Driven to their wits' ends, the Irish turned the hides of their cattle into leather, which they exported to England. This was also forbidden. Then they took to sheep raising and sent fine wool to England. At this, the landed interest of England took alarm, and Irish wool was declared contraband by Act of Parliament.
State papers in Ireland in 1560s include instructions to the Lord Deputy reminding him that
the Irish shall not carry their wool or frieze beyond the seas, save into the realm of England, whereby His Majesty's subjects may have the working thereof.
This shows that the Crown wanted control, not total suppression. Irish wool could move, but only if it benefited the English industry. An English pamphlet of 1613, A Discourse on the State of Ireland, argued,
"It were dangerous policy to suffer the Irish to grow rich by making cloth."
The prohibition was only partially effective, as enforcement was weak. Ireland's ports were porous and smuggling grew, especially to Spain, France and the Low Countries. As export of raw wool was limited, more wool was worked up within Ireland itself, leading to a growth of a native Irish woolen industry, particularly around Dublin, Cork and Limerick.
If the Irish be suffered to set up their own cloth-making, the English trade will decay. It were better they send their wool into England, where our people may be set to work.
By the mid-1600s, the Irish woolen trade was again flourishing.
In the days of Whigs, lawyers who successfully tricked a judge would brag of having pulled the wool over the judge's eyes.
Refugees from Europe, Walloons, Huguenots and Quakers, brought new skills and were attracted to Ireland because of the burgeoning industry, setting up manufactories in towns like Clonmel, Cork and Wicklow. Irish friezes, stockings and cloaks were all exported by Dutch and Spanish merchants, undercutting English competitors in cost and quality.
Some West of England clothiers, finding their trade decaying and themselves very poor, emigrated to Ireland, tempted by the cheapness of wool and of living and the seemingly thriving state of the country.
Despite restrictions, the Irish woolen industry boomed due to cheap labour, low rents and abundant wool. Dublin, Cork and Limerick became centres of fine broadcloth, kersey and frieze. Irish exports heading out to Spain and Portugal and Mediterranean were usually smuggled. Irish Lord Deputy Thomas Wentworth explicitly used the economic policy to keep Ireland dependent on England, as he laid out in a letter to the now Charles I in 1634.
I intend to make Ireland dependent upon England and not able to subsist without her.
He promoted export of raw wool to England, discouraged Irish cloth manufacture, and imposed duties on Irish exports that competed with English goods. Sir William Petty, writing in 1672, warned that Ireland could outproduce England.
The people of Ireland have the advantage in cheapness of living, and therefore may underwork us in all manufactures.
So Irish woolen manufacturers were making great strides. Dutch and Spanish merchants were now exporting Irish woolen stuffs, and also a great quantities of sheep's, grey and white frieze and stockings from Cork, Youghal, Waterford and Dublin.
Did you see records of not just stockings getting exported but also hats, along with the yarn and the frieze? There is a kind of an element of, I suppose, snootiness I noticed when Irish wool gets mentioned. It does tend to be regarded as a coarser kind of wool. I'm in two minds as to whether that really was the case. Sometimes I am suspicious about references like that.
Coarse wool does get used for garments from 3,000 years ago until the modern day, because sometimes you want that coarse fabric to keep you warm. It also obviously keeps you nice and dry and insulated if it gets wet. So particularly if you have it as an outer layer, a coarse fabric is a lovely thing to have. But people also grow accustomed to coarser fibers. And so what we might think of as itchy, if we're used to kind of modern polyesters and things, people probably didn't think were itchy throughout most of human history. And if we started using them again, I'm sure we would probably agree.
In 1688, woolen manufacturing was established to a considerable extent in the liberties of Dublin. The Coombe, Pimlico, Spitalfields and Weaver Square were then built, and soon became the residence of all that was opulent and respectable in the city.
Government papers declared that by 1698, the industry supported 12,000 Protestant families in Dublin and 30,000 across the country. The English woolen industry now suggested a tactic we see today in the US of severe tariffs in order to control the Irish industry.
They proposed that a duty of 43.5% should be imposed in Ireland.
As the anti-Irish rhetoric ramped up, one English commentator wrote
that it would be more advantageous to England by the one half to buy these goods and throw them into the sea than to suffer Ireland to sell cheaper than we can in foreign markets.
What England really wanted was to shut Ireland off completely and finally from its foreign markets, and she believed nothing short of an actual prohibition would do this. The English Parliament finally formally asked the King to do something about the success of Irish woolen industry. So King William III declared before Parliament, "I shall do all that in my power lies to discourage the manufacture of woolens in Ireland." He did just that when he subsequently signed legislation forbidding Irish woolen exports in 1698, under penalty of forfeiture of goods, vessels and fines of £500.
So ended the fairest promise Ireland had ever known of becoming a prosperous and happy country. The ruin was absolute and final.
So we know that Irish wool was good quality, but we also know that the Irish market was under the control ultimately of those English masters. And so they were able to squash it down and stop that trade practice.
Despite the onerous restrictions, a vibrant clandestine trade persisted. Reports from 1739 indicate Irish traders continued to smuggle combed wool to Lisbon and France, where they undersold both local and English manufacturers. French ships patrolled the coast looking for smuggling opportunities from the smugglers known as owlers. The French reportedly taking up to 300,000 packs of wool away every year.
You see, it's called smuggling, but in reality, for the people who lived in, we'll say, the south coast of Ireland, the southwest coast of Ireland, it was just the trade they'd always been conducting with the continent since medieval times. But it starts getting called smuggling after the English conquest, because of course then Irish people are seen to be trading with the enemy. So it's a change of terminology, but it does still happen. And even to England, even in England, some Irish wool does get through to England, you know, even in that period, despite the ban.
If yarn was a twitty or full of twits, it meant that it had faults such as knots, which would make the weaving process more difficult.
Into the 1700s, the Irish wool industry declined. Producers, cut off from global markets, focused on coarse cloth for the poor. Skills and quality deteriorated. By 1779, Dublin sheriffs reported that
19,000 persons connected with the weaving trade in that city, besides many other poor, were on the brink of starvation, and that nothing but an extension of trade and a free export of manufactures could save them.
Although the restrictions were finally lifted that same year, Ireland was now far behind Britain and Europe in technology and in trade, while in England and on the continent, the Industrial Revolution was underway, and it would change the wool trade forever. Inventions were coming in that would clean, brush, spin and weave wool faster than any human. It meant more money for the owners, but less work for the poorest. The 19th century brought resilience as the industry struggled. Although scattered across the country, there were a few notable exceptions. Some mills survived and seemed to thrive, such as Selbridge, the biggest wool manufacturer in Ireland, and the Ardfinnan woolen mills, founded in Tipperary in 1869, who gained renown when King Edward VII commissioned a coat in their Galtee motor frieze. These are just a few examples. In Donegal, weaving families preserved the traditional hand-woven tweed. Using locally sourced plant dyes, they produced cloth that became internationally recognised as Donegal tweed.
My sons now, I have two sons weaving it's in the fourth generation now.
Fourth generation.
But 150 years back.
And you
at
were
least.
all the time living in Ardara?
No, I was reared in Lourdes Point. It's about 3 miles from here.
Yes.
And everybody down in that district were all spinning and weaving. Them all at hand looms. And in fact, they used to even sit up at night, they used to put on a double shift.
The late 19th and early 20th century also saw the emergence of the Aran sweater. A sweater that was made famous later in the 1960s all over the US by the Clancy brothers, who at one stage were one of the biggest bands in the US. Their instantly recognisable Aran jumpers came out of an invented tradition of the late 1800s to help Irish rural communities.
With the shears on their fingers that time. Sheared them, the sheep would lie down there, it's quite as the lamb is often you. She'd lie there, it's quite for them, and the whole fleece was sheared back of her out and pulled out on the head. They were packaged in bags, and very few was washing it in them days. I think only selling it without being washed. It had to be washed in later years to get the highest price. If it wasn't washed, they had to sell it at a lower price. There was merchants coming to the town and buying it and sending it off. They were buying it very cheap of them days.
In the 19th century, market traders would claim that consignments of Uruguayan wools always contained full Montevideo bales. Over the years, this became full Monty bales and eventually the full Monty.
In the American Civil War, private soldiers were issued with cheap uniforms which made of a new kind of fabric called shoddy. This was part of a new trade in recycled wool that had begun as far back as 1813 in England, where old woolen clothing was taken apart and mixed with new wool and made into uniforms and cheap clothing.
In the woolen manufacture, shoddy or refuse wool, which was formerly sent to Kent as manure, is now sorted over, and a great proportion of it is retained for again working up into new materials.
This trade in recycled wool was a large business throughout the 1800s, with as much as £30 million of rags being used by the 1850s. Greedy manufacturers, recognising the massive profits available, used less new wool in the uniforms, and so the name shoddy became to mean something that was badly made.
The commercial injuries inflicted on Ireland proved permanent. The Irish woolen manufacture was by no means destroyed, and after a few years, a considerable quantity of Irish cloth and stuffs made or mixed with wool were used at home. There was also a small clandestine exportation of Irish woolen stuffs abroad. This was, however, very insignificant, and England was perfectly successful in her efforts to abolish all chance of Irish rivalry in foreign markets.
In some of the folklore accounts I've seen from, we'll say, the 1930s and 40s in Ireland, where women remember their time in the mountains looking after cows, they also say that, especially in Donegal, they also say that all the time they were knitting as they went along. They were knitting stockings or whatever all the time, and that probably came from, it was probably wool they were using. So wool was still part of their lives all the time in a cottage industry sense, but it just didn't become the market outlet that butter became.
In 1921 or 2, when we became a republic or independent or whatever, the Brits took all the machinery back and closed them all down, and they didn't want competition. I think it took most manufacturing in the country back with them.
By the 20th century, wool was still important. In 1938, it ranked 4th amongst the world's most valuable raw materials. But the rise of synthetic fibres, acrylic, polyester, nylon, changed everything. They were cheaper, lighter, and easier to wash.
You know the story of the First World War. In England there wasn't enough wool to go around. I might have told you this before, and the government brought in a kind of a challenge, I don't know what you call it, for somebody to come up with a replacement for wool. And Mr. DuPont, working in England and New York, 2 laboratories, and they came up with the solution, and they called it after the laboratories.
While Irish designers such as the Wynne sisters of Avoca briefly elevated Irish wool to the European catwalks, and coarse wool supported a mid-20th century carpet industry, global competition, particularly from China, would ensure a long-term decline.
And it happened that we started to go to Bob Waterhouse to get him to make tops that's washed and combed wool, going to the knitting trade. And David had a good friend who was the CEO of one of the knitting yarn companies, and he said, will you sell our English wool in Ireland? And I looked at it and said, oh, another English brand. So I came up with, we make our own brand, and we use the Galway wool only. So we call it Galway Heather. And that went on for about 20-something years, and then there was a major crash. 1989-90. We were paying £2.50 a kilo, transferring to kilos, in 89-90, and after perestroika in Glasnost, bang, down to 20 cents or 30 cents a pound. China and Russia both went out of the market at the same time, and they were using 40% of all the world's wool when it crashed.
The great thing is that a lot of those crafts have upheld the tradition, whereas we still have the iron sweaters being produced, the weaving is, but the wool has gone.
We have to find modern uses and demand for the wool, and we believe that creating an Irish grown brand will be part of that mission, because most people don't realise as tourists, when they buy an iron sweater, the only thing Irish about it is the shop that you buy it in, and that it's probably New Zealand wool. The design may be from Ireland, but it's probably manufactured in the Far East somewhere. So it's not an Irish product at all.
We couldn't believe actually the appetite in America for what we're doing, and we were blown away. The Americans are really supporting what we're doing, and they really get what we're doing. They love seeing the resurgence of Irish wool.
Wool is renewable because sheep create a fresh fleece every year, and its natural characteristics make it an environmentally benign alternative to all the synthetics.
And we are seeing, especially across industries, that consumers are asking for that more. A lot of brands are now having to be sustainable, not because they want to be, but because they have to be, and that's a win-win.
A material that's known for being insulating, breathable, elastic, soft, biodegradable, fire retarding, UV protective, and anti-wrinkle. It can be woven into anything from a tough water-repellent working fabric to an extremely fine, luxurious cloth.
I knew when it was knit up that it was really worth chasing. It was gold to me. It was beautiful.
If it has all those properties, and it's sustainable for the planet, then somehow we need to put the producers of wool and the growing industry in the craft of wool together to make sure this amazing material gets used properly again and creates the industry standards around the world that we know now that we once enjoyed.
And this material can become valuable again, but not in the format that it originally was.
There's people there that love the Irish products. Why can't we promote that a lot more? And we can develop small industries throughout rural Ireland, which the likes of my sons and daughters can work in and be able to earn a living on it.
A gleam of hope dawns upon our country. May that good being who delights in the happiness of his creatures unite all hearts and knit them together in the bonds of a holy brotherhood.